Lou Ragoose broke a story a couple of weeks ago about the decision by a judge to toss out a jury's guilty verdict in a fraud case. And that got a lot of attention. So Lou kept at it and found some more.
The $7.2 million mailbox. That's how prosecutors described to the jury the supposed office of Promise Health LLC, the home health care company owned by Abdi Fattah Yusuf on Central Avenue in Minneapolis, where several other similar businesses were supposedly located. Jurors saw dozens of checks written to Yusuf's wife and family members and $1.1 million in bank transfers and cash withdrawals to himself. Money Promise Health received through state Medicaid reimbursements for claiming to provide personal care assistant or PCA services. The jury saw it as fraud and convicted Yusuf of 6 counts of theft by swindle.
It was not a difficult decision whatsoever. The deliberation took probably 4 hours at most. Based off of the state's evidence that was presented, I was beyond a reasonable doubt.
What the jury didn't know is that before they deliberated, Judge Sarah West tossed out the top charge of racketeering. Then 3 months after the verdict, Judge West made the rare move of tossing out the full verdict as well, giving Yusuf a judgment of acquittal.
How is that not obviously fraud?
With a circumstantial case, there has to be no other rational hypothesis other than guilt.
Paul Young, a former prosecutor and current defense attorney not connected to this case, says Judge West's decision stems from a review standard backed up by Minnesota Supreme Court rulings usually used in appeals of cases that involve mostly circumstantial evidence.
In other words, if there's another reasonable explanation, that could be the reasonable doubt.
Court records show other Hennepin County judges tossing related cases before they reached trial. Judge Amber Brennan dismissed the charges against Yusuf's wife, Lol Ahmed, and Judge Hillary Caligiuri dismissed charges against co-defendant Abdi Weli Mahamoud.
I saw this story and immediately I was outraged.
Republican Senator Michael Holstrom requested all exhibits from the Yusuf trial and says he's researching what can be done to stop and better prosecute these cases in the future.
Even with extreme judges, they knew that going in. We need to be able to overcome that when the evidence is so clear.
And lawmakers say that they are checking if any law changes are needed. Now, to understand what circumstantial evidence is, all that means is that you need to make an inference. Like in this case, for example, there were a lot of phony and obviously phony time cards. And so the jury could make the inference that because this guy was paying out, Mr. Yusuf was paying these people who turned in these phony time cards, that he was clearly aware of the fraud and it was an inference of guilt. But what the judge is saying, that there could be a reasonable hypothesis that it meant something else. Like maybe somebody else was committing the fraud and he didn't know it within his organization.
Yeah, but what's hard to square is that you have a jury, right? And that's what the conclusion they drew and what we all kind of think of how trials work. And the judge is dealing with like the legal parts of the law. That's where it doesn't make sense to the common person.
Yeah, and not only that, the jury is not asked to use this standard that we talked about in this story. That is a review standard that's up to the judge, or more often the Court of Appeals or the state Supreme Court later on. What makes this case completely unique is that this judge didn't let it get to the appeals court. She completely dismissed the case after the verdict.
I bet there's going to be a lot more stories that get to the bottom of this or more court cases that you'll cover, Lou, so we look forward to that. Thanks.